Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about arrangement. The reason for that is it has actually been quite a while since I talked about arrangement, so I thought it would be time for me to actually tackle it. And I wanted to do it in a way that is very simple, from the ground up, just building up all of the concepts that I use to actually arrange a track. So we're going to start off by looking at an example project where I set up different arrangements and experiment a little bit with a few different ideas. And then we're going to go into an actual project of mine and we're going to look at some tips there as well. So let's start by looking at this project here. And here you can see a few of the different kind of experiments I've been doing with arrangement. And what I mean with experiments is just figuring out how I want to actually talk about arrangement and how I actually want to present this topic. Because there are so many different things that really bundle all together into the whole thing that is arrangement, that it's really hard to just start talking about one thing and then turning it into a cohesive story. So I'm going to try my best here, but it is going to be fairly complex because I do want to start from the beginnings, but you have to kind of mention a whole bunch of different concepts before you can actually make up an arrangement. So within this project, I've laid out a few of those different concepts. So right here we have macro structures. We then have a little bit of a dive into levels, and then we have a few segments laid out here. And finally, we have a track to explore. So let's just start up from the top here. So macro structures are the most outer shell of your structure, kind of the big picture of your track. You can see how they laid out. Here we have intro, drop 1, build, drop 2, break, drop 3, outro and fade. So this is the structure of the whole track, the bigger picture. What you'll find is that there's a few types of different macro structures. Usually within progressive Psytrance we have two major types, which is the 3-drop structure and the 2-drop structure. The difference really comes down to theming and the way that you assign different elements to different parts of the track. So we'll look into that a little bit later. Really the difference between a 2-drop structure and a 3-drop structure is the way that you assign elements to the track and the way that you work with themes. And you can really see that in the way that it's actually laid out here. We have 3 times a 3-drop structure and then a 2-drop structure here. But you can see that there's no real difference between all of these structures. There's a very few amounts of modifications that I can make to this one. So for example, like this, and then just making this one longer. That will actually make it almost the same structure. And I say almost because what is different is the names of the drops. And that's actually fairly important. So just to move back to how it was, you can see there are other differences in these structures. These are obviously just example structures that I'm kind of experimenting with. And you can see that the key difference here is that the first 3 have a drop 3, whereas the last one has a drop 1 and a drop 2 here. So imagine that you are at the start of a track and you have maybe written down a few of the theming elements, or you have maybe written down a few different loops and you want to start working towards the arrangement. What is the actual difference between a 3-drop structure and a 2-drop structure? Well, in a 3-drop structure, what you have is that you set up a theme in the intro and usually also at the start of the first drop. You then go into some synths later on in the first drop here. Then there's a little bit of a build-up and then you switch up the track. Usually there's maybe like a switch in bassline, or there's a significant switch in lead sound, something like that. Or maybe you have this crazy vocal that's coming in, something completely different from what you were doing before. Then you go into a break and then you bring it back to that first theme that you set up at the start. So you have this kind of back and forth where you go first theme, then you go to the second theme and then you go back again. A 2-drop structure is more of a story. You start up with a theme and then you develop that into the first drop. Then you go into the break where you change that theme. And then in the second drop you have a different theme. So you're going from one theme to the other. You're never going back into the start again, into the earlier theme that you had before. Now that doesn't mean that all of the elements in the second drop are completely different from all of the elements in the first drop. There's maybe a little bit of overlap. There might even be significant overlap in the overall theming elements of your track. Maybe you have something like a cool vocal line that you use throughout the whole track, but then you have different lead sounds in the first or in the second. Maybe you even have the same lead sounds in the first and the second drop, but maybe you switch out the bass line, something like that. So those are macro structures. Now let's look at levels. And the macro structure really is the level 1 of your track. It's the most outer shell, as I said before. It's like the whole track as a structure, as some building blocks. But obviously it's not just going to be, oh, here we have one drop and that's just going to be a kick and bass for the whole way through, up until this build where it stops, up until this part where there's another kick and bass for this whole bit here, and then there's a break where there's no kick and bass, stuff like that. These bigger elements can be broken down into smaller elements of the structure. So the smaller building pieces are really the segments of your track. So let's have a look at some of the segments here. So I've divided them up into different lengths here, as you can see, and a very classic length to use is 16 bars. That's kind of the most common length to use for normal kind of progressive psytrance that I'm used to making. So you can see I have a level 2 and a level 3 here. What we can do is we can take, for example, level 2 and just start placing it here. And this will be our level 2 segment. So this will be drop 1 dash 1, the first segment of drop 1. We duplicate this over, we create drop 1 dash 2. And we can just fill in the drop like this, continuously. So as you can see, now we have 5 segments here, and that's kind of the typical length of one drop segment. It is overlapping with the build here, so we'll have to look into that in a little bit. For now, let's focus a little bit on the level below that, the level 3. When we divide up the drop into segments, what we eventually want to do is have a little bit of a change between each segment. We want some progression in the track. We maybe want to start building up some synths. Maybe we want to start adding some extra vocals or effects so that the drop becomes more interesting and more energetic over time. So we need a point within each of the segments where we can transition into the next part of the drop, right? Into the next segment. And that's where fills come in handy. So I'm just going to copy over this first bit here and I'm going to duplicate it into here, so I can talk a little bit about how these transitions are helpful. So again, just thinking about a standard Psytrance track, what we'll often hear is that we have a very slow intro and there are some pads in there. There's maybe a little bit of a build-up like in this part, and then we go into a little bit of a fill before the drop, and then we go into the actual drop. What you'll hear at the start of the drop is that it's very low energy still. There's maybe a synth every once in a while, there's some pad sounds, some atmospheres, maybe some vocal stuff like that. But you don't immediately go in there and have your massive synths or FM lines or whatever. Those really come later into the drops. You're kind of building up the energy over time. So really these fills allow you to transition into the next stage of your energy level. It allows you to up your energy level as you're building up the amount of synths that you have when you finally want to go into your massive synth. You have a little bit of a fill there where the kick and bass isn't there, and that allows you to maybe bring in the lead already, get the listener used to the lead, and then when the kick and bass comes back, he's already used to the lead. Now you can see that I don't just have one segment in here. I have a few different ones, and for example, this just one with a fill that is double the size. So we can take this one in a space where we want to make a little bit of a bigger jump in energy. And I'm going to talk about energy in a little bit. What I first want to do is kind of show you an example of how we fill in this particular drop 1 segment, and then I can explain through a very clever way, I think, the actual energy level of our track and how it progresses throughout your drop. So maybe what we want here is a little bit of a longer fill, and as you can see towards the end here, what we have is that we want to have a build up there. So to respect that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to double my length of segments. And what I can do is get a 32 bar segment. As you can see, this is a very long drop here. It is actually 16 plus 8 bars up until we get into the build-up. And usually what you'll hear with these build-up segments is that it's not, okay, the kick and bass stops here and we go into a snare drum, but the kick and bass kind of rolls through and there's a high pass filter on the kick and the bass that kind of lowers the energy level of the kick and the bass itself, so that other higher energy elements can come in, such as a snare roll, such as a bunch of different risers, such as the filter cutoff on your main lead, and then you can go into the fill into the next drop or whatever. So just to demonstrate how this works, I'm going to take this lowest level of the segments here, and I'm just going to duplicate that in here. What I've done now is I've loaded up a utility here, which I can use to show you what the energy level of a track might look like. So at the start, there's very slow elements. There's not much happening. You're setting up the listener for the drop that is about to come. So you're starting off very, very slow in your Psytrance track. Then you build up the energy up until the build up. Maybe you go down a little bit as you come out of this point. And then with the build up, you really start to pump up the energy. Throughout the drop then, what you'll hear is that usually at the start of the drop, there's like a big delay tail, or there's maybe something like an impact sound. So the energy maybe goes down a little bit over the time of this drop. And then we go back up here. But you can see that overall between here and here, the energy level is rising. So maybe now for this next segment, what you'll find is that instead of having an impact just at the start, there's also an impact halfway through. So our energy level might look something like this. Finally, another thing that you might hear is that over the length of this drop, for example here, there will be something like an acid line or a sequence or whatever there is that is just opening up over this whole part here. So that would be an energy level that is kind of going up till this point like that. Now this can be accompanied by, for example, hi-hats that kind of open up as well, that are filtered in as well. There's a lot of different things that you can do when you're combining different elements to kind of direct the listener to the same energy level. It's not just one synth that is opening up. You have your synths, you have your drums that are coming in, you have some risers in there, maybe you have a vocal line that becomes louder over time, stuff like that. All of that combines into one energy level of kind of the whole track. So finally we go into the highest part energy here maybe. So what we can do, for example, is get a little bit more energy out of this fill, really open up all of the filters, add some distortion to all of the leads, stuff like that. And then what you'll find is that there's a little bit of an impact maybe, something like that, but it's still very high energy. So I should probably indicate it by having it fairly, very high. And then towards here, maybe there's something like this. Again, going up, we go down a little bit at the start of the build-up, and then we go back up again, because the build-up is essentially an element that raises the energy level. Now from here, a trick that you can do that's also very common within Psytrance is that you have this high energy build-up, and you're building up to like a very high moment, and then within the fill, you'll just take all of that energy away. You really lower down the energy level when you get into the drop. What that accomplishes is that you really have this idea of a high point, as also you have a lower energy level so that you can start doing that all over again. So here you have another drop that you can play with, and you can start to layer this out and write down the energy level of the track in the same way. Now what you'll find is the way that we're looking at this part of the track here, this is how I actually structure my marker track, which is the track that I use to kind of lay out the structure before I actually start producing the track. You'll often see that I have a utility on there that just kind of sketches out the energy level, how I think the energy level will progress throughout the production. Usually this is an initial idea, and what I end up doing most of the times is just stray away from what I've actually written down in my marker track in terms of energy level. But what I like to do is I like to at least keep the actual segments that I have updated, because this is a really nice way to kind of indicate where you are in the track. When you're, for example, zoomed into your production, you can see, oh, this is where the fill is, this is where the drop is. You can see, okay, this is where the middle of the drop is. If I'm trying to insert an element in a certain place, I can find it within the structure very, very easily. I don't have to look for all of my leads to kind of identify the structure that I'm going for. I just have that on the track, and it's very easy to actually spot what's going on in your production. So at this point, you might be excited to actually start experimenting yourself a little bit with structuring, but how do you actually get to a point of this? How do you actually find, for example, macro structure that you can then start to fill in with fills and stuff like that? Well, one of the things that I like to do as sort of an exercise, which you can also do in your own time, in your own DAW, is to just open up a reference track, and without even really listening to it, just try to identify the different segments within the track, just based on the waveform. So what we can see is that there's some kind of pattern here. You can see the kind of slow movements that we often see within a pad. You can see that the energy level is going up a little bit here, and then we start to see this transient to appear. So this will be some kind of a build-up, because this is probably some kind of kick that is coming in there and already starting to hype up the crowd, build up the energy. So we can kind of say that if we look at this track, that we have an intro here, like this, and I just color it in the same way that I always color my different elements. And then we have a build-up here. Then we go into the first drop, and you can already see that we have a fill here. So we can indicate that. You can see already exactly where the fill ends, because you can see kind of the energy level going up into this point of the fill. You can see like the volume here, and then it goes down a little bit and then back up again. So before we continue with this exercise and I talk a little bit about it more, I might have seemed like I just kind of said, okay, volume equals energy level. And that's not the case. Energy level is something a little bit harder to describe. It's not really something that you can measure in a track. There's no measurement that you can do to find the energy level, but it's probably a concept that you're familiar with as a producer, because you tend to think in that kind of way. It is a very natural way to think about your track is, okay, how much hype is there in a track? If you have a lot of different leads layered on top of each other, and there is this complex kind of drum loop layered on top of it, a lot of high end is usually a good indication. What we often associate with high energy are those snare rolls that you hear in build-ups, stuff like that. A lot of different risers that increase the energy level because they're rising up, they're becoming louder and they're becoming higher in frequencies. Other indications might be the amount of crashes that sit in a drop and the amount of effects that are used in a drop, the amount of downlifters and uplifters, stuff like that. How much is the filter cutoff for the lead jumping around? If it's fairly stably going up, then that's a lower energy thing than if it's jumping all over the place. But it also has to do with, for example, the sound design. How much distortion are you using? How much delay and reverb is there? If there's a lot of delay and reverb, you get a lot of ambient feeling. Also the same with atmosphere, you get a lot of ambient feeling, and that really tends to slow the track down and lower its energy level. Whereas a fairly dry lead really kind of cuts through the mix and has this very high energy feeling to it. So again, it's not something that you can measure, it's more something about feeling. And that's what I want to make clear here. This automation line that we just drew out here is not something that is a quantitative measure of what we're actually doing with the track. This is just a feeling that I'm trying to build with the track. So here we can actually just duplicate this segment and you can see that it nicely slots in the waveform again. And let's see if we can do that again here. Yes, we can. And then finally we'll see if we can do that again here. And now you see that there's this little bit of a weird, almost like it's shifted forwards a little bit. And you'll hear this more often in other tracks as well. The first time I actually found this was in Deep Jungle Walk. The very first segment of Deep Jungle Walk is actually 17 bars long. So 16 bars of drop and then 1 bar of fill. Which, to be honest, I don't really get. Maybe there's some kind of resolving that you're doing here. But to me, I've always found it weird that this is actually being done by professional producers. But it's still something that I noted sometimes. So maybe this is something that you can implement once in a while in your track as well. You can see this happens once in the track and you'll see that it never really happens again. What you do see though, that as a consequence, this next segment is shorter. So that when we get into this part here, where there's another different kick and bass, you'll see that this is actually shorter and this is back on the grid line. Now again, I have to explain a topic here. When I say grid line, what we're meaning is that it falls in line with what you kind of see in the grid of the DAW, which I know in my version is a little bit hard to see, so I can maybe make it a little bit easier by, for example, going here. And I'm just going to make 2 MIDI clips here, one like this and one like this. Color this one a different color, and now I can duplicate it. And we can duplicate it across the whole track, and we'll later analyze the actual structure of the track towards how these little segments, little divisions sit within the DAW. You'll see that it's really tightly aligned with this actual structure here of just segments of 8 bars. So here you can see we have another part of drop, and then you can see the volume kind of going down. So this is probably some kind of breakdown or buildup. Again, without listening, you don't really know, but I'm not going to actually play it, partially because I want to avoid copyright issues, but also because I want to show you that you don't actually need to listen to the track to be able to do this exercise. If it is a well-mastered track and it's well mixed, you should just be able to find out the structure from the actual waveform, like we're doing here. So this is some kind of build-up or breakdown. I'm going to kind of put it in the middle. This is partially my color for build-up, which is this one. And it's also similar to the color of breakdown, which is this one. So it sits kind of in between. Finally here, you can see we have some kind of impact and then a little bit of a drum fill or whatever. So this is going to be our fill segment. We're building up until this point, and then we're going to fill up this space before we get into the actual drop. So again, this is orange for fill, and then we have a drop here. Now what you'll see here in this second drop here is that one, we have a different baseline, but we also start out with a different structure length. So this is actually 8 bars. And then we go into a fill here. And if I duplicate this over, you'll see that it's somewhat the same again. There's a little bit of a fill here where there's no kick and bass there. At least there's no kick, there's a little bit of a bass roll there. So let's just draw that in like that. And then we have another fill here. You can again see that there's no actual kick and bass to be found here. There's a few kind of other drums. This is probably some kind of tom fill, something like that. So again, this is a fill. So we can already determine that this is a 3-drop structure because we have drop 1 right here. Then this is a different drop, different baseline, different kind of structure length or segment length. And then we have this 3rd drop here, which means that this is the 3rd drop where we probably return to the old version, how it was in drop 1. Now actually this track does something a little bit special in that it already goes back into the theming right here, into the old kick and bass, so to say. So this is also again a 16 bar segment, 15 bars of drop and 1 bar of fill. Finally, you can see that this final drop here is actually 16 bars long, and that's because right after that we just go into the breakdown, so we don't really need the fill to go there. But this is again somewhat of a breakdown, maybe somewhat of a build-up. I'm again going to call it in between, and then we can see again from the waveform that there's somewhat of a fill here. You can see that it's kind of slowing down again, which is probably a good indication of what is actually happening to the energy level here. You'll find that there's a lot of risers here and a lot of, maybe there's like a snare roll, or there's a lead that's building up, like an acid lead that is opening up its filter cutoff, something like that. And what you'll find is that usually up until the point where the buildup happens, all of those items rise up and then they just disappear. So you can actually see that in the volume level. So that means that we have a fill here, and I can go on and fill in the rest of the track. I won't actually bore you by doing that. So this is the exercise that you'll do. And what you'll probably notice is that there's a lot of differences between all of the different structures, especially if you go explore different subgenres. That's actually a very interesting thing to do, is going into a Psytrance track with a completely different subgenre of mine. Maybe you want some kind of very progressive tracks, or maybe you want something that is like dark side or forced, something like that. You'll find that those genres still deviate fairly far from the structures that we're seeing here. But what you'll notice is that all of the rules are the same. What you might find, for example, for prog or progressive, where we have bass lines like this, where a very staccato bass line or a very complex bass line, is that each of the segments is usually a lot shorter, or you'll have a lot more fills. That's of course also the case in this track, where we actually have drops from 8 bars, 7 bars of actual kick and bass and 1 bar of fill. So the length of your segments is what I like to call your structural density. How dense is the structure of the track? If you have a very high dense structure, what you'll usually find is that the elements themselves are very simple. Usually what you hear in, for example, a prog track is that the kick and bass is doing all of these kind of complex things, and then you have maybe a few extra drums, but that's it for the elements. There's usually not a lot of different leads on there, maybe an atmosphere or two. And what you'll find then in those cases is that also the structural density of your track is much greater, so the segments are much shorter. If you compare that to a forest track, where you'll have often even 32 bars of just kick and bass, and your drum loops just going on, and your hi-hats and your leads and whatever, just all going on steadily, and then after 32 bars you have a little bit of a fill and then you switch it up. So that means that those kind of tracks have a lower structural density than the tracks that we discussed before, the prog tracks. Now maybe quickly something to kind of clarify here. When I say prog, I don't mean progressive psytrance. With progressive psytrance I mean artists like Asterix, Outsiders, and even the stuff that I like to make. When I mean prog, I'm more thinking towards something like Jillax. To be honest, for me, that's really the only artist that comes to mind right now. I should have probably researched this before I started filming. I'm actually not that familiar with that type of subgenre of psytrance, but I hope that you get the idea that there's a difference between those two different subgenres that I'm talking about here in this case. So now there's a lot more theory that I want to explain, but I actually want to go into a project to actually show you what's going on there. And the reason for that is, from now on, we're no longer going to look at the structure, for example, of the kick and the bass and the drums, what we've been looking up until now, where we have dissected kind of the structure by looking at, okay, where's the fills, where are the breaks, where are the build-ups, where are the intros, stuff like that. We're going to look within one of the drop segments, how do you place different elements? Because that's the next step, diving deeper and deeper into smaller details of your structure. So here I am in an actual current production of mine, and you can actually see the structure track right here. So this is a structure track that I used, and you can see, following the kick and bass, that it pretty much follows the structure that I have right here. Now if I were to play you the track, what you'll probably hear is that the energy level is fairly different from what I had set up right here. I specifically know that for this part, the energy level is a lot lower than for this part. You can also see that in the amount of drums that are in here versus in here. But also there's a lead change in there, where it goes from a fairly distorted lead into a much less distorted lead. But you can see that this marker track, this structure track that I showed before, is actually something that I like to use within my actual productions, and I recommend you do the same. And the reason for that is, as I said, it is very easy to use that to actually navigate through your project. Now I do see that there's a little bit of a problem here. So just to satisfy my OCD, I'm actually going to fix that right here. There's just a fill that I added later on in the track here. So that's now actually included within the structure track. I should probably also turn off my sidechain trigger right here. So now that I'm seeing that, let me quickly fix that. But with that out of the way, let's actually see how I start adding elements to the track. Because right now you have your structure, you have all of these segments laid out, and you have your kick and bass filled in. You have all of your drums in places depending on the energy level that you want to achieve. How do you actually start adding your lead sounds and all of the effect sounds and all of the one-shots and all of the grid synths and all of that stuff that you want to add to an actual Psytrance track? And the very first thing that you'll notice for me personally is that there's a nice balance between lower energy levels and the types of elements that I tend to use. What you'll see here is that I have fairly long elements. You can see there's this kind of arp here that I put in here, which we can kind of disregard, but all of these elements here, and even these elements, although the MIDI clip is short, that delay tail is actually very, very long, and they all sit in here and they are used very sparsely. You also see that I have a lot more pads and atmospheres that I arranged right here. Then as we're building it up, you can actually see that we're starting to add more and more elements to it until we finally arrive at something that looks like this, where there's a lot of different elements placed on top of each other, as well as whatever lead that you have in there. So this is a main lead line that I have, which is very melodic, it's very distorted, and it's kind of very high energetic kind of lead. So that's the first thing to notice. The second thing to notice is that there's actually a fairly overarching rule in that what you do to add your elements, to decide the actual position of your elements, it's all up to the vision. So what I mean by that is, let's look at this example here. You'll see that we have one segment right here, which is this length. So I can bring that down to the leads like this. You can see that it encompasses 2 of these leads and 2 of these leads. And what that means is that if I take this and I duplicate it over here, that you'll see that it lines up. And the same is true for this one. Same is true for this one, although these are different kind of subcategories of the same element. One is going down in modulation and the other is going up in modulation. This is a nice trick that I like to use to kind of get a call and response between the first half of the drop and the second half of the drop. So you can already see that there's this kind of symmetry between this part here and this part here. Really along the halfway point is this symmetry. Now what we can do is we can keep dividing to actually get into more and more places where you can place elements. So one of the things here is that I have an element right here that slides into this point, that kind of rises into that point. You can hear that we have this kind of flute sound here, this one. And you can really hear it gliding into exactly this point here. This is where it stops and it becomes a delay tail. We also have other elements, like for example the downlifter somewhere here. I don't exactly know where that is, but there was something in there that kind of lifted down from there. It is actually this element here that I mean. So that sounds like this. The way that I placed it in there and the way that the kind of waveform is formed, it really doesn't look like this is the point where it's coming down from, but when you hear it in context, you'll definitely hear that it's not happening right here and that you start to notice it right after this part here. So it actually comes down from this line here. So we've already been able to make this division line once. Now, if we make it again, what you'll see is that we end up here and here, which is where these 2 elements are. So right here and right here. So this is halfway between this element, which is the start of the drop, and the halfway point, and this part and the halfway point here. So then we have this and this, which as you can see lines up with those 2 elements. So now let's divide it up again and do it again, and what you'll find is that this element sits right in a halfway point between this line and this line. So that sits right in the middle right here. And this lines up with that element there. Now on the other side, What is also interesting is to just sometimes not place an element on the division line. So right here, the division line would be right here, but there's no element that really sits there. There's nothing that plays right before it, there's nothing that plays right after it. What does happen though, is that if we were to kind of envision this halfway point without there being an element, and we make the division again between this line and actually this line, you'll see that there's an element that sits right before there. So that kind of announces this line, while this line is not being announced. So this division point is not being announced, but we're actually dividing one time more than you might imagine. Like if you really wanted to just kind of structurally go at it, what you'll do is you would have every division would have an element. But what I would like to teach you is that that's not often the case. What you'll often do is skip one of them so that you have a more interesting structure at the end. But still, you can look into your arrangement and look at each of the individual elements, and it's usually fairly easy to find kind of the division line that each of the elements is lined up against. Technically, for melodies, it's the same thing. If we look into this melody, you can see that it's actually 4 different segments. If I color these, it's easier to see. But you can see that it's 4 different segments that total up to one section. So this is the same melody here, this whole thing, and that repeats and repeats and repeats. It's the same melody over and over again. And this is what you do within music. Music is often this kind of collection of patterns, collection of repetitions. Especially in Psytrance, if you think about it, for example, a kick and bass just repeats every beat if you have a normal rolling kick and bass. And even if you go into something like prog, which we talked about before with a more compressed bass line, what you'll find is that those complex bass lines really are made up out of patterns. This is actually something that I've done a video about. If you remember that video, then you know what I mean. But there's really a way that you can kind of divide up your segments into lower, kind of smaller bits, and then you align different elements with that, from melodies to kick and basses to the way that you align drums, the way that you align crashes, risers, downlifters, stuff like that. Also one-shots like we saw before. So at the end of the day, all you do when you're structuring your elements in here, and you might have even been doing this subconsciously without even realizing it, but you're making these divisions. Maybe now that I'm pointing this out to you, you might say, oh yeah, I actually know this. I actually know that I'm doing this. I've never thought about it this way, but this is something that I do. I also make, for example, a 2-bar melody and then just repeat it 8 times to get to a 16-bar section, which is perfectly normal. That's the way to do it. Within melodic elements like this specifically, which this is kind of like an fairly aggressive sound like this. So that kind of lead there, the melodic leads, they really benefit from kind of this repeating melody to just drive the idea into your mind so that you actually remember the melody. That's how it's done, through repetition. So in order to repeat it effectively, what you'll see is that you just need to divide up your segment into smaller kind of parts here. And what you'll find is that the easiest way to do that is just to take your segment, divide it up by some amount. In this case, I've divided it up in 4, so I can place the same melody in there 4 times. Now, I won't actually dive into this melody, I'll actually just tell you what it is. But within the melody itself, what you'll find is that the melody itself is also actually 4 times the same rhythm, but playing different notes. And that's another kind of repetition. So really what I want to hammer down with this section is that repetition and division is everything within like inner section arrangement. Within the section itself, you're just dividing up the section into smaller bits and you're arranging there. And what you'll find for your more busier parts, like for example this one where we have more different elements, is that there's more and more divisions that you have to do. First of all, here in this part you can already see that we need to do kind of divisions of a bar, right? So for every bar here, we have one that ends at the first bar, we have one that ends at the third bar, one that ends at the 5th bar, one that ends at the 7th bar, and so on and so on. So the more elements you have, the more divisions that you make. But again, we are sometimes just completely skipping over some of the bigger divisions to get to the smaller divisions. That keeps our structure interesting. So for example, our biggest like major division that we can do is the halfway division, which is right here. And there's elements around that. Okay, then we go up until here and there's elements around that and that. And let's make the division again. Here, again, there's an element, but right here we lack an element. And this element right here actually sits one like level lower in terms of the amount of divisions that we have to do. So this sits on this line right here. The same is true right here in this part. Again, it's one division line lower, so it sits right around this division line. What you can see is that some of the elements revolve around the center waypoint. So if I have my biggest, outest division that I can do, the halfway division, I can take certain elements and just duplicate them over and end up with the same thing as it was before. The same is true for this element. Again, if I duplicate it, it sits right there as well. The final thing that I want to say on this topic in particular is that there's sometimes an exception to the rule. Sometimes you break out of it, like we saw before, where we had 16 bars of kick and bass and then a fill of 1 bar, where you have thus a 17 bar segments. There's this one time or two times within the track that you kind of strafe away from the golden rule, strafe away from this rule of division and clearly dividable segments, so that you can kind of shake it up for the listener. Now, I actually don't really have an example for you in this track here. What I do show you an example of is the one time that I actually decided to use a 32 bar segment in here. So this is one lead that just plays the whole bit here, and it takes the whole time to kind of evolve and become louder and sound bigger and sound more high energetic. And then what you'll see is the more and more we go to the back, obviously this part isn't done because this is an active production, but you'll see that there's more one shots towards the back than there is towards the front. So we're building the energy up over 32 bars instead of 16, like we've done with all of the other segments within this track. So while I was editing this, I actually discovered that I missed quite an important topic in this part of the video. So I'm back recording in the same session, and I want to explain the difference between the 3 types of synths that we use around the points of interest. So what I mean by that is, throughout all of what we have seen here when we're looking at all of the one-shots, you might have noticed that some of them I place before them, so like this one. And some of them I place after them, like this one. You could see this as the point of interest. You can see how one is before them and one is behind them. Then there's other examples which actually sit around the point of interest. So I think this is a good example here. You can see this would be the point of interest. There's a little bit before it and a little bit behind it. Same here, this would be a point of interest between this line and this line. And you can see this element sits around it. So to circle back to the 3 different types of sound thing, you can think of it as that we have sweeps into a sound, we have sweeps out of a sound, and we have sounds that sit around. So this is a sweep out of a sound, or something like an impact. You can hear how the focus is really at the beginning of the sound. It has a nice strong transient, it has a lot of punch to it. It is an impact sound. And therefore it means that it's sitting right after the line. Right? So it draws interest to the line because that's where it impacts from. That is the exact point where that kind of nice, gritty, punchy start of this sound sits. A different example is the kind of sweep up sound. And here's a little bit of an odd version of that sound. You can still hear the kind of sweeping up effect that this has. I didn't want to just get like a normal sweep sound where the synth filter cutoff is just opening up and you kind of have all of the standard ways. I wanted to show a little bit of maybe an alternative way to do it. This is, in my opinion, a sound that is sweeping into kind of the end of the rhythm, the end of the melody, where it just transitions to just being a delay tail. If I play it with the drums and the bass, you can hear when the crash happens, you can kind of hear the contracts between the sound itself and the line that we mean. Because the crash is an impact sound on the same line, so you kind of have an idea where it transitions into. You can hear that it's kind of fading into when that crash happens. Here I have a more traditional example. This sounds like this. You can hear it kind of fading up and becoming louder. So that's kind of the sweep sound. The final sound that I want to show is, let me see where I have it. Something like this, which really sits around the point of interest right here. So this is kind of an atmosphere that kind of just comes in, becomes a bit louder towards this point and then fades out again. So that was everything that I still wanted to explain. Hopefully this makes things a little bit clearer, and let's get back with the original video. So that's everything I wanted to talk about in regards to arrangement. And again, what I want to say is, even though this video might sound very, very complex, it is still technically the very basics of arrangement. This is just kind of the basic way to do it. But what I feel is important is that you actually understand these basics really, really well. So again, what I want to say is, if any of these topics were not clearly explained to you, maybe you should watch the video again, that part of the video, or maybe you should reach out to me. You can leave a comment down below if you need help with that, or you can message me on Discord if you want to maybe speak privately or speak for a little bit longer, have like an actual discussion with that, because that's a little bit hard to do in the YouTube comments. But I really want to invite you, if you made it to this part of the video, you're clearly interested in arrangement and you might have issues with your arrangements and you're looking to actually solve those problems, is to actually actively engage with all of the examples that I've shown. Maybe do a few of the exercises that I've shown in here, the one where you deconstruct a reference track. Maybe really try in your next production to focus on these individual things that I taught you here. The sections, the divisions, the repetition, all of that kind of stuff. And from there, what you'll see is once you have that mastered, once you can kind of almost automatically start placing your elements in your different sections and your different like macro structures, all of that stuff, you'll see that the rest of your production really starts to flow. Because from there you can make better decisions on, for example, the lengths of your delays and your reverb tails, stuff like that. You can make better decisions on the way that you want to sound design atmospheres so that they fit the energy level and the structure of your track. You can start to look into making your own effects so that the effects really follow the structure of your track and that they kind of integrate with what you're doing in the rest of the track. You'll find that you're also able to apply this technique to really complex fills. So I'll just quickly play you this example here and you'll find that this is a very complex fill that I'm doing to get back into the drop here. What is actually going on here is that the same theory is used. Again, zooming in here and opening up this group, and this group, which is the fill here, reveals that some of the elements that sit in here in the first part also sit in the second part here. Again, revolving around this division line. So this is a quarter of the fill here, right? This is a quarter and this is a quarter. And you see that we kind of duplicated this idea over up until here, but with a few slight changes to just make it a little bit different and a little bit more interesting. But again, it's the same kind of division rule. So before you start thinking about making a very complex drop or something like a very complex lead, think about these principles, because I know that it's going to help you if you actually understand these and actually know what you're doing within the principles that I explained in this video. Therefore, again, I want to say if you have any questions, you can contact me either in the comments or in Discord. If you found everything clear and you found this explanation helpful, you can let me know by leaving a like. That way I can kind of gauge how you guys react to the different ways of explaining that I do. Finally, if you're here on this channel for the first time and you want to see more of what I do, you think maybe that I explain very, very well or something like that, then you can support the channel and you'll also be notified of my future content if you subscribe, and especially if you turn on the bell notifications. That way YouTube will message you whenever I upload something. So that's going to be it for the video. Again, I hope you enjoyed. This was a little bit of a longer one to put together and also for you guys to watch then. But I hope that you enjoyed either way. So this is going to be it. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.